Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin and Contemporary Issues with Dr. Brovkin. Today's presentation I called What President Zelensky Could Have Had. To start with, there is a saying, when you want to get it all, sometimes you will wind up with getting nothing. So this is a short history of the current war in Ukraine, beginning with December 2021. And then there are several stages, which at each of those stages, my argument is, President Zelensky could have had more than what he got at the end of that period and the beginning of the new one. So if we start the story in December 2021, this is when President Putin made an appeal to Western powers about collective security. And the major objection was not to allow Ukraine to be in NATO. Now, Ukraine wanted to be in NATO, and the West could have said, well, you may want it, but we are not going to be admitting you because there are other concerns, such as that Russia considers presence of American troops and missiles in a NATO country close to its borders, in the territory that used to be a part of the Soviet Union, contrary to all the arrangements and agreements of the preceding decades. So Putin said this in what came to be known as a ultimatum, and in my older videos you can find a detailed discussion of that, was that there should be no NATO in Ukraine, and the Crimean Peninsula that had voted to join Russia after the coup d'etat in 2014, it remains Russian. So this was the starting position. In other words, if in December 2021, the West encouraged President Zelensky to accept these conditions, there would have been no war, and Ukraine would have had everything except Crimea, which voted right in 2014 to join Russia, as it is a Russian-speaking territory. Now, about the Donbass, as we discussed in many preceding videos, there was the so-called Minsk Accords, which guaranteed autonomy to Donbass, a special status to these two republics or two provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk, in exchange for no military action and no support for separatists. In other words, they would have remained officially a part of Ukraine. They would have had Ukrainian money, Ukrainian citizenship, Ukrainian everything, except they would have had special relationship with Russia, open borders, trade, and autonomous status. Now, also in December 2021, Putin gave another chance to guarantor powers to France and Germany, and there were meetings in Paris and in Berlin with the last hope that they would prevail on Zelensky and Ukrainian leadership to accept fulfillment of the agreements that had already been signed and not implemented for many years, since 2015, which means a special status for Donbass. Now, this is the time when Zelensky could have agreed, and in that case they would have had it all except with the exception of Crimea. Now the West chose to say no. The West at that time said, Western countries, and I mean NATO countries, said no, Ukraine has a right to choose any form of defense agreements it wants, including joining NATO. Now Putin to that said, no way, we are gonna use military means if necessary to stop expansion of NATO. So this was the situation in December, January 2021, and then January 22. Now, as we all know, in February, the military action began, and very quickly, within a matter of 2 months, there was a new situation, which was known now to be almost a deal to conclude peace. So this is a second situation that Zelensky could have had a pretty good deal. And in recent weeks, both the Ukrainian participants in these negotiations and in Russian chief of the delegation made all kinds of revelations, and Putin himself quoted from this document, which was a peace treaty that was signed but then Zelensky walked away from it. Now, what was the deal? The deal was very favorable to Ukraine in that it would have had everything except Crimea and Donbass. Now, the two republics had already been recognized by Russia, had already applied to join Russia, had already been accepted into Russia, so there was no way they could go back to the status only 2 months earlier. However, there were all kinds of flexible arrangements made that Ukraine could have an army, that there would be security guarantees, and the two crucial points were that it would not be a member of NATO, it would be neutral, and that the two republics that wanted to separate will now be separate. In other words, Donbass would be Russian. Now, if Zelensky had agreed to that, then there would be no war. In other words, there would be no 200,000 casualties, there would be no all kinds of destruction that Ukraine went through, and also Donbass itself suffered greatly during the war. So this is a second chance that was not utilized. This was dropped. Now, the new revelations also show why this was not done. There's great discussion going on in the Russian and in the Ukrainian media as to why this did not happen. The story goes that Boris Johnson came to see Zelensky, and he basically promised everything. It would be support for as long as it takes and no matter what it takes. And apparently there are Russian speculations in Russian media that it was not just Boris Johnson, but it was the American side that basically said, go on fighting, we will help you as much as we can, as long as it takes. So this was the decision made in May 2022 to continue the war. The war aims were two: to return all the territory that seceded from Ukraine, including Crimea, number one, and to join NATO. So this was a war to join NATO, a war for NATO membership and to get the territories that seceded. Now, let me remind you, my dear listeners, that these territories are inhabited by the people who are Russian, who speak Russian, who consider themselves Russian, who had been in Russia for generations. And Ukraine itself was a part of Russia and Russian state for 400 years. And the only time that these territories were given to Ukraine was in 1922 by Comrade Lenin and Stalin, who wanted to have a Russian population in there consisting of workers who presumably were communist in order to exercise influence on Ukrainian society. So this was but when Ukraine went nationalist and wants to join NATO, wants to ban Russian language, these territories chose to split and go back home, which is to Russia. Okay, so now we begin the most interesting part, which is from the summer of 2022 to the fall of 2023, which is just now ended. This was the period of the so-called offensive, Ukrainian offensive, and some successes which made them think that they could win everything. So Ukraine conducted a mass mobilization, 700,000 troops. It received billions and billions. How many billions exactly? Close to 100 billion or more of all kinds of military assistance, and the Ukrainian army was paid by the US, by the United States, and the supplies of food and ammunition and all kinds of things. Abrams tanks, Leopard tanks, Storm Shadow missiles, all kinds of stuff was given to Ukraine to win. And they actually thought they would win, because this was the official story, not just of Zelensky, but of most official Western Rand Corporation projections, all sorts of things that were conducted at the time. The official goal of the United States was to force Russia to suffer a strategic defeat. And if we look at foreign affairs articles on Mr. Zaluzhny, commander-in-chief articles, and the plan a year ago at the end of 2022 was to smash Russian defenses, cut Crimea off from Russia, destroy the bridge that links Crimea to Caucasus, and essentially go back to the borders of 1991. And officially today, even today, this remains the official war aim of Ukraine, to conquer back Donbass and Crimea. And they have the support of the United States and of the European Union, whose leaders repeat ad infinitum that is the goal, to return the territories back to Ukraine in the borders of 1991. Now, they forget, of course, that if they manage to realize this goal, which is very unlikely, they would have 5 million Russians who don't want to be there, who speak Russian, and they don't want to learn Ukrainian because their language is Russian, that had always been Russia, and they don't want to be Ukrainianized. So Zelensky may wind up with 5 million people who don't want to be there, who would want to have population of that is his choice. In any case, now we go to this year of the offensive. After the peace deal collapsed, the Ukrainians did have a military success that made them think that anything is possible. Russian army was only 200,000 in this theater, and the Ukrainians have mobilized and became 700,000, and there was a successful operation around Kharkov in the summer of 22, and the Russians withdraw. And then they also withdraw from Kherson because they were afraid that they would not be able to supply the troops if the bridges were blown up and it would be flooded. So they withdrew, and that made the Ukrainians think that they could actually win, because the Russians are withdrawing. And they were encouraged by the US and Britain, and they got all these Storm Shadows and got all these Leopard tanks and Abrams tanks and all kinds of stuff, and they thought they were going to win. But this is the most interesting part. We're now going to go to this so-called counteroffensive that went on the entire year 2023. Now, what is interesting here is that despite the enormous sanctions on Russia, despite the fact the European Union stopped buying oil and gas, despite it was expelled from SWIFT, all kinds of measures, and despite more than $100 billion in military aid to Ukraine, the results of the offensive were and are zero. There were 3 villages that they managed to take after enormous expenditure of resources and very heavy fighting. Now, according to Russian statistics, the Ukrainians lost 170,000 men and women, but mostly men in uniform, during this so-called counteroffensive. And they also lost hundreds, and I don't want to go into detail, hundreds of motorized vehicles and personnel carriers and tanks. And Abrams tanks didn't get a very good reputation in Russian fields. Even Ukrainian soldiers saying that they don't get along with mud very well, and there's plenty of mud in Ukrainian fields, and so on and so forth. But the point is, important lessons should be drawn from that failed counteroffensive. And that is that the West learned the hard way that to win over Russia on the battlefield with conventional warfare is impossible. Impossible, okay? Because the United States public opinion would not go and accept 170,000 American troops dead if they were fighting. Now, one could say, of course, if the American troops were there, there wouldn't be that many casualties because they would have airplanes and all kinds of other support. Yes, but don't forget, for every American plane, there is a Russian airplane. If they use F-16s, well, there are MiG-29s. But if they start using F-35s, there is Su-35, which is equally good and is available in the same numbers as in the United States. So the point is that the conventional warfare, even if the Poles joined it, even if the German army joined it, even if the American joined it, would not work in the Russian field. This is the biggest lesson to Stoltenberg and the NATO, that to win against Russia conventionally is close to impossible, or it would require the kind of fighting that the Israelis are doing now, which is carpet bombing and missile attacks on Russian cities. But everybody knows that if they do that, there will be missile attacks on the American cities and on any other country that joins the fight with carpet bombing of Russian cities. In other words, this is a no-win situation. Now we come to this situation that Zelensky is facing now. He could have had pretty much all of Ukraine with the Donbas autonomy, but now he's lost this opportunity, and now the Russians are saying that the moderates are saying we could make a deal, but we're not happy with just Zaporozhye and Kherson added to the territories. A lot of them are saying now we should liberate Odessa and Kharkov. But that's the moderates. The more hardliners, like Secretary of the Security Council Medvedev, a former president, he basically says there should be total capitulation of surrender of Ukraine in Kiev, and then some of them are even saying no, all of Ukraine should not be allowed to engage in any action with the West against Russia. So, in other words, Zelensky lost, and the only thing he could come up with in response was to say that there may not be any elections in 2024 in Ukraine. So there goes another pipe dream of Americans, that they're fighting for democracy. There's no democracy, there's no elections, and there's no victory. So that's where we are in December 2023. Thank you, and please subscribe, and I'll see you soon with a new update.